Greetings, comrades. Today we turn our eyes towards the island of Sri Lanka, an island more famous for its pristine beaches and verdant hills, for its tea, for its tourism. Today, all eyes are on Sri Lanka because it is in the midst of an unprecedented crisis. It is, and without exaggerating, one may say, it is on the verge of complete economic collapse. A crisis of this nature, of this extent, has not happened in the history of the country since at least the British era, when the country was racked by crises caused by the Second World War. Today, hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankans are on the streets protesting against the misrule of the Rajapaksa brothers, against the price rises, the joblessness, and the consequences overall created by this crisis, which can best be characterized as a crisis induced by neoliberal policies. And it is worth mentioning here and important to think of such a crisis when it happened in Venezuela, when high inflation, hyperinflation, and degradation of the country's reserves and a crisis of the country's currency created conditions in which people had to leave the country by the millions, when they were losing their jobs, their livelihoods, when the country was in economic chaos. And this was happening in Venezuela. Almost every single mainstream media outlet reported on it and characterized it as a failure of socialism. This propaganda was drilled into our heads that Venezuela was a crisis caused by socialistic policies. Yet, when a similar crisis emerges in Sri Lanka, the same people go quiet. They either do not talk about it, they do not report it. Instead, what we see are only snippets of what is happening there. Protesters, mostly apolitical protests in which no particular banner is visible. Such popular protests targeted only against Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Mahinda Rajapaksa, the two brothers who ruled Sri Lanka today, and am I right, with an iron fist. It is interesting that such selective coverage, such narratives are created, ignorant of the fact that today Sri Lanka's crisis comes as almost a culmination point of over 3 decades of neoliberal policies, one that should have created by now a stable free market economy. None of that was actually achieved. In the history of Sri Lanka, we see an island that was colonized for at least 400 years of its modern existence, first by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, and finally by the British. And the British established the foundations of a commodity driven economy, one that revolves around tea, timber, and rubber, till neoliberal reforms in the 1990s. Sri Lanka followed a sort of state run statist economy in which state corporations and state monopolies had a dominant hold over the economy. And this economy was geared again towards resource exploitation. At no time were they free of this commodity curse. They remained in the periphery of the world economy and they remained trapped in a sort of economic mode that characterizes most semi colonial nations today. One that hinges on three things: the exportation and exploitation of cheap labor, exportation meaning including sending of migrant labor workforce to other countries, the exportation and exploitation of resources. In case of Sri Lanka, that means agrarian resources, primarily rubber plantations and tea. And in the political sphere, the best that Sri Lanka or any country in Sri Lanka's position can really do is negotiate the terms of their exploitation by the world by playing off one power against another. And this has characterized Sri Lanka's politics and to an extent even its economy. Much is being made of Chinese debt. Yes, China has contributed towards pushing Sri Lanka towards the edge. It has contributed to adding its debt burden. But let us consider this, that only 10% of Sri Lanka's external debt is actually owed to the Chinese. What about the other 90%? India is in there, but the major stake of it is held by the IMF, the Asian Development Bank. A big chunk of it is again held by Japan. We see here not just a simplistic case of China pushing a country towards debt and collapse. We see here a failed economic model, one that has trapped a country within the periphery of capitalism, one that has trapped a country into inherently exploitative relationship with the world's imperial powers. And by that, I mean the those countries which are at the core of the world's financial system. The IMF, the Asian Development Bank, and major lenders like China and Japan are, of course, at the core of this. And the nations which hold the biggest stake in IMF and Asian Development Bank being in the core of this. In the midst of all of this chaos, the geopolitical game is also unraveling. India is giving soft loans of $1 billion to bail out Sri Lanka, because India does not want chaos in its borders. India does not want a country that, for the most part, has been its ally, its subordinate ally, one may say, to fall apart. This is being presented as some sort of altruistic gift, but this is actual politics at play. If, say, an ally of the United States were to suffer such an economic collapse, it will not respond with sanctions, unlike what it did with Venezuela. No, it would try to bail it out. India is trying to bail out Sri Lanka. And who are the people running Sri Lanka? What is the Sri Lankan state like? Present government, the Rajapaksas, they have blood on their hands, the blood of Tamils. In the Second Elam War, they presided over the massacre of Tamils, the genocidal war over Tamils. And these are the same people who have now pushed Sri Lanka towards an economic catastrophe. And this is not the first time that economic crisis has hit Sri Lanka. During the entire course of its history, especially after the neoliberal reforms, we see an inconsistent growth rate, we see slowdowns and even recessions happening. And during this period, starting from the late 70s, we saw an outburst of ethnic conflict, of discrimination towards Tamils, and of a hard, repressive politics towards the Tamils. These things have gone hand in hand. On the one hand, priming Sri Lanka for exploitation at the hands of global capital, and on the other hand, playing this kind of divisive and repressive, discriminatory policy towards the island's minorities. Now it has come to a breaking point, because today the people of Sri Lanka, both Sinhalese and Tamils, are coming together. They are protesting on the streets. There is a show of solidarity and unity like never before. And they are challenging one of the architects of divisive politics in Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas. And what must come out of this is a break with the neoliberal policies that have pushed the island towards this position. In the first instance, there must be a rally to challenge and to repudiate the debt that Sri Lanka owes. Right now, the burden of this debt is being shouldered to the working class. They are being punished, the poor are being punished for the mishandling and recklessness and greed of the elites. We must put our full support behind the brave people of Sri Lanka who are out on the streets protesting, knowing full well that the full repressive machinery of the state will be used to counter these protests. The army had been deployed in one instance, but now they have been forced to be pulled back. The Sri Lankan government is on the back foot, and perhaps, we don't know, if these protests go to another level, then maybe even this government will have to take shelter in a British warship, like they did in 1953, when the island nearly came to a revolution. Sri Lanka has potential. This is the place where the Indian Trotskyist movement was born. This is the island of Philip Bonaparte, one of the heroes of the Bolshevik Leninist party. Today, we stand at a precipice, and perhaps we may even stand on the cusp of revolution. We must pay keen attention to the events in Sri Lanka as they unfold. That in this video, Sri Lanka.